Alright, so this is my idea or concept for a Vision Age of Ultron buff. And technically, Age of Ultron Vision doesn't really need a buff. He's been in the game for almost 7 years now, but he's kind of a weird champion because he hasn't been available as a 5 or 6 star for the longest time. And he has good utility. He has Power Burn, Power Steal, Heal Block, and Double Immune. And he's a tech champion. That's really all you need from a tech champion. But his damage is pretty crappy. So he's a very simple champion. I tried to give him a very simple buff or update. I took inspiration from a few different champions. Quake, Guardian, MCOC, Ultron, and Ghost. And to start out with, just like Ultron, he has functions. Like in the movie, Ultron wants to turn into Vision, right? Do I remember that correctly? Like Vision is his ultimate form, his final form. Do I remember that correctly? So like they're connected in a way. So I figured if Ultron has functions in his buff, I would give functions to Vision in his buff. So but they're a little different. First, he is immune to bleed, poison, and cold effects. This would activate a function. Now, functions activate a Vibranium armor buff with a max of 5. And these Vibranium armor up buffs give 5% extra armor rating and 5% extra block proficiency rating. Armor buffs are spent when using certain abilities. So you use these functions to get armor buffs, which increase your defense. Then you can use these armor buffs for certain abilities, which I will talk about in a little bit. Our other functions are reach 35% or 65% health to regenerate 15% max health. That's a function. Bringing opponent to 0% power inflicts a heal block debuff for 10 seconds. That's a function. End combo with a light attack, inflict siphon debuff function. All power the opponent gains, you take 10% of that power and give it to Vision for 10 seconds. You can only have one active on the opponent at once. So basically like a power steal debuff. I think Vulture has something like this, but this is my version of the siphon. Land a heavy attack on the opponent, refreshes all of Vision's personal debuffs on the opponent. That's a function. And now by personal debuffs, I mean the debuffs that Vision can only activate that are in his base kit. Heal Block, Siphon, and Concussion. You can only refresh those, and I'll talk about the Concussion a little later on. This I took inspiration from Guardian. Perform a perfect block, parry, while the opponent is using a special attack, function. Opponent's special damage is decreased by 50% if parry is successful during the special attack. Now, I didn't want it to be a perfect block, just like Guardian, like a copy and paste, so it's only 50% of the damage is reduced from the special attack. I thought a 50% reduction was enough. And same thing, but this time with the heavy attack. If the opponent is using a heavy attack, if you're able to parry it, you will activate resist. The opponent's heavy attack will fail to break your block, and that's a function too. Not too sure how practical that is, but it is what it is. Now, doing all of these, remember, activate function, and then function will give you a Vibranium armor up buff, and you have a max of 5. Now, what do you do with these armor up buffs? Charge heavy attack, activate a power gain buff, granting 5% max power every second until a heavy attack is released. And charging and holding heavy attack for 1 second spends 1 armor up buff for a permanent Jarvis buff, increasing Vision's crit rating, crit damage, and attack rating, plus 10% increase each. Max Jarvis buffs is 3, so you can spend your armor up buffs to give yourself Jarvis buffs, and these Jarvis buffs increase your attack rating. And then if the opponent strikes Vision while he is charging his heavy, you can also spend an armor up buff to activate a passive phase buff. Phase makes the opponent miss all attacks for 1 second. Because in the Marvel movies, he activates phase and he makes people miss him like multiple times. And I thought, just like with Ghost, he should have a phase mechanic. So that's how you spend 1 armor up buff while you're charging a heavy to gain a Jarvis buff and also make the opponent miss. World's strongest supercomputer. This I took inspiration from MCOC. Fighting against different classes, grants certain abilities. Now versus Cosmic Champions, trying to learn from cosmic unknown entities, armor break effects only remove one armor up buff at a time on Vision. Fighting Mystic Champions, understanding the mind and spirit gives every buff on Vision a 50% chance to become passive, which then makes it immune to nullify effects. Then fighting Science Champions, Vision, I made a few typos on this, sorry. What I meant to say was Vision memorizes experimental formulas, which then gives him a 50% chance to shrug off any debuff. Because you know, Science Champions are all about putting debuffs on the opponent. And then Skill Champions, weak minds means weak wills. All debuffs placed on the opponent have a 50% chance to convert into passive, immune to shrug off or purify. Fighting Tech Champions, hacking into enemy technology, opponents attempt to heal block or manipulate power on Vision has a 50% chance to fail. Power Steal, Power Jam, Power Lock, etc. So fighting Mutant Champions, learning from human evolution into mutants to find their weaknesses. All of Vision's attacks are unable to be critical. When a critical hit would occur, damage comes in the form of red energy damage. Now this also comes from Guardian and Ultron. Because Ultron got a new ability when fighting mutant champions. Anytime you would inflict a bleed, it's instead turned into a degeneration. So I wanted something for Vision like that too. So anytime you would crit, it's instead non-critical, but it comes in the form of red numbers, just like Guardian does all the time. Alright, Vision's ability accuracy cannot be reduced, and abilities cannot fail to activate. Passive damage on Vision fails, and heals Vision for the damage that failed to activate. Now this is straight up a counter to my most hated champion in the game to fight. I hate fighting this champion, Domino. She's my nemesis. I always mess up fighting Domino. So anytime you're fighting a mutant and they give you passive damage, it fails, but the damage that would have inflicted on you, Vision heals. Vision heals for that amount of damage that would have activated. Alright, debuffs placed on Vision, remember, from mutants, suffer minus 50% ability accuracy and or potency. When the mutant opponent would activate miss or evade, Vision can activate auto block at the cost of one armor up buff. So that's another way you can spend armor up buffs. Alright, now we're moving on to special attacks. So, you know how right now in his awakened ability he has Power Steal? Now that's no longer a thing. In his base kit, in his base abilities, he has Power Steal. So, Power Burn from special attacks. All power burned from opponent, Vision takes 10% of that power as his own, Power Steal. So 10% is kind of a low number. So, to make up for this, his awakened ability instead powers up his Power Steal, makes that Power Steal percentage higher. I'll talk about that later though. So, all the special attacks are basically the same. They all do the same thing. It's just the higher the special attack, the higher the damage or higher the potency. So all special attacks have Power Burn, all special attacks have energy damage, and a concussion debuff. It's just the higher the special attack, the higher the potency for all those abilities. So special 1, Mind Gem Energy Blast. Power Burn 33% of the opponent's max power. Spend one armor up buff to inflict concussion debuff for 10 seconds on the opponent, and this will have minus 33% ability accuracy. For each debuff active on the opponent, deal an additional 33% energy damage. Special 2, Super Robotic Strength. Power Burn 66% of the opponent's max power, and then you spend one armor up buff to inflict a concussion debuff for 10 seconds. This time it's minus 66% ability accuracy. For each debuff active on the opponent, deal an additional 66% energy damage. And finally, Special 3, Infinity Stone Power Unleashed. Power Burn 100% of the opponent's max power. Spend one armor up buff to inflict concussion debuff for 10 seconds. This time it's minus 100% ability accuracy. For each debuff active on the opponent, deal an additional 100% energy damage. Now, remember, all the debuffs that you have are Heal Block, Siphon, and now Concussion. So for each debuff active, deal an additional 100% energy damage. That's an additional 300% energy damage. And remember, you can refresh the debuffs from a heavy attack. So use a special 3, then refresh that concussion, and for the whole entire fight, the opponent has minus 100% ability accuracy. Now, to recap, all of the armor up buffs, what can you spend them on? You can spend them on auto block when you're fighting a mutant champion. You can spend them on concussion from the special attacks. You can spend them on Jarvis buffs when you're charging your heavy, and those Jarvis buffs increase your attack rating. And then you can also spend them to make the opponent miss, because you want to hold your heavy as long as you can to gain more power, and then also get that Jarvis buff. So, and then if the opponent attacks you while you're charging your heavy, you spend an armor up buff to make them miss. So those are all the ways you can spend those armor up buffs. And then if you don't even want to spend the buffs, they give you extra potency, or they give you extra defense potency, like armor rating and block proficiency. And also, you probably want 1 on you at all times, just in case, for a Havoc counter. Now, his awakened ability basically powers up all of his abilities that he already has. So, special attack Power Steal is upgraded an extra 10% for every 50 SIG levels. So, SIG 200 means 50% Power Steal. Earlier, it was 10% Power Steal, now it's 50% Power Steal. And you start the fight with 1 Vibranium Armor Up buff. SIG level 1 means you gain 1 buff at the start of the fight. SIG 100 means you start with 2 buffs at the start of the fight. And SIG 200 means you start with 3 armor up buffs at the start of the fight. And then remember earlier, the max amount of Vibranium armor up buffs was 5. Now it's upgraded if you have the awakened ability. SIG level 1 means the max is 6. SIG level 200 means the max is 7. Alright, supercomputer 50% abilities are upgraded. If you remember earlier, when fighting certain classes, you have a 50% chance to have certain abilities activate. For example, fighting a science champion, Vision has a 50% chance to shrug off any debuff from science champions. Now that 50% chance is upgraded. An extra 5% for every 50 SIG levels. So at SIG 200, all those 50% abilities earlier are now 70% chance. So now every buff on Vision has a 70% chance to become passive, so it's harder for the opponent to unnullify them versus Mystic Champions, obviously. Now finally, Jarvis buff potency is increased by 1% for every 20 SIG levels. So if you remember earlier, charging and holding heavy for 1 second spends 1 armor up buff for a permanent Jarvis buff, increasing crit rating, crit damage, and attack rating, plus 10% increase each. So now an additional 1% for every 20 SIG levels. So that is my Vision Age of Ultron buff. I try to keep it as simple as possible. It's a little complicated, like where do all the armor up buffs come from and how do you spend them, but I'm pretty sure I made it pretty clear. And he has pretty good counters to almost every annoying mutant. For example, he can't crit. He has armor buffs to counter Havoc, and if the opponent misses or evades, then you can activate armor. You can spend an armor up buff to activate auto block. So there's a lot of different ways he can counter mutant champions. And this would be my version of a Age of Ultron Vision buff. Let me know what you think.